On May 26, 1966, late at night, Elvis Presley stood in front of a microphone at RCA Studio B in Nashville, Tennessee, surrounded by 11 singers, and recorded How Great Thou Art in 4 takes. When the final take ended, Felton Jarvis, the producer standing on the other side of the glass in the control booth, the man who had been hired specifically because of his ability to handle Elvis's preference for recording through the night, was weeping. The people in the room stood still. They had just heard something that had very little to do with the music industry and everything to do with a small boy in a church in Tupelo, Mississippi, 30 years earlier, squirming off his mother's lap and running down the aisle toward the choir because he could not sit still while the music was happening. This is the story of How Great Thou Art, where it came from, what it cost to record, why it destroyed the people in that studio, and why the man who had spent the previous decade making beach movies and singing soundtrack songs cried when he talked about the music he had made in those 3 nights in Nashville. And it is the story of Elvis Presley's relationship with gospel music. Not the commercial gospel that gets mentioned in biographies as a footnote to rock and roll, but the music that came first, that was there before Sun Records and before the Ed Sullivan Show and before any of it. The music he heard from the pews of the Assembly of God Church in East Tupelo when he was 2 years old. Gladys Presley told the story herself more than once. She said that from the time Elvis was barely old enough to walk, he could not sit still in church when the music started. He would slide off her lap, run down the center aisle, scramble up onto the platform, and stand there looking at the choir with his mouth moving, trying to sing along with them before he knew enough words to do it properly. He was 2 years old. The Assembly of God congregation in East Tupelo was a Pentecostal church. The services ran long, the singing was emotional, the congregation expressed its faith loudly and physically, and the music that filled that small wooden building on hot Mississippi nights was the first music Elvis Presley ever loved. He attended that church for 13 years until the family packed everything they owned into their 1939 Plymouth and drove north to Memphis in search of better work. The music went with him. In Memphis, Elvis discovered the Ellis Auditorium, where gospel quartets performed all-night singings that drew enormous crowds on Saturday nights. He went every month. He sat in those audiences and watched groups like the Blackwood Brothers and the Statesman Quartet perform with an intensity that biographer Peter Guralnick describes as the roots of Elvis's entire future stage act. The Statesman's bass singer Jim Wetherington, known as the Big Chief, standing at the front of the stage with his leg jiggling ceaselessly, the material of his pants leg ballooning out, moving in ways that preachers regularly condemned as lewd. Elvis watched all of it and absorbed all of it. But the performer who affected Elvis most deeply was not a rock and roll musician, not a blues singer, not any of the artists who got credited in the biography pages of his career. It was Jake Hess. Hess was the lead singer of the Statesman Quartet, a man who had grown up in a sharecropper family in Alabama with a father who taught him that singing was talking on key, that the most important thing about gospel music was the words. Hess had studied harmony at the Stamps-Baxter School in Dallas, had been performing since the age of 5, and by the time the teenage Elvis was watching him from the audience at the Ellis Auditorium, Hess was already considered one of the finest singers in the gospel world. Not famous in the way that pop artists were famous, but known deeply by everyone who understood what it meant to deliver a lyric with complete conviction. Elvis said it plainly in later interviews. Jake Hess was one of the greatest singers he had ever heard. Jake Hess, for his part, said of Elvis, "He went about as far as you could go in gospel music. The women would jump up, just like they do for the pop shows. That observation that Elvis's effect on gospel audiences was the same as his effect on pop audiences tells you something important about where the performance instincts that made Elvis famous actually originated, not in rock and roll, in the Assembly of God Church in East Tupelo and in the all-night singings at the Ellis Auditorium in Memphis. When Elvis left for the Army in March of 1958, and when his mother, Gladys, died in August of that year, the music he returned to privately, not in studios, not for record labels, but in his own house, for himself and his friends, was gospel. The Memphis Mafia described the nights at Graceland where Elvis would gather the group, sit at the piano, and work through hymns and spirituals for hours. Charlie Hodge and Red West were the ones who sang with him most consistently in those private sessions. This was not rehearsal. There was no audience. There was no money in it. It was Elvis doing the thing he had always done when he needed the music, going back to what had existed before everything else. By 1964, the Hollywood years were at their worst. He was churning out soundtracks for formulaic films, recording songs he did not believe in, watching his chart success decline as the Beatles and the Rolling Stones reshaped what popular music meant in America. In April of 1966, Elvis told his team he was ready to record new material, not movie songs, not pop singles calculated for radio. He wanted to record gospel. He had been singing it at home for months, working through the material with Hodge and West in the private sessions that had become a regular feature of life at Graceland. Studio time was booked at RCA Studio B in Nashville, the same studio where Elvis had recorded most of his non-soundtrack work since 1957. The sessions were assigned to Felton Jarvis, who was making his first appearance as Elvis's producer, specifically because Elvis preferred to record at night and Jarvis was willing to work those hours. It was the beginning of a producer-artist relationship that would last until Elvis died in 1977, when Elvis's health declined seriously in the early 1970s and Jarvis needed a kidney transplant in 1972. Elvis paid for it. For the backing vocals on the album, Elvis wanted something larger than the Jordanaires, the quartet that had worked with him since the mid-1950s. He had originally hoped to bring in Jimmy Jones, a great African-American bass singer whose gospel sound Elvis admired deeply. Parker's team searched for Jones and could not find him, so Elvis assembled an 11-person vocal group that included the Jordanaires, Millie Kirkham, and several other professional session singers. And then, at the center of it, Elvis requested the one singer whose presence meant more to him than any other, Jake Hess, who had recently formed a new group called the Imperials. Jake Hess was in the building. The man Elvis had watched from the pews of the Ellis Auditorium as a teenager, the singer he had described as one of the greatest he had ever heard, was standing in RCA Studio B in Nashville to sing backup on Elvis Presley's gospel album. Elvis was so proud of this that he had Hess's voice brought up in the mix on multiple songs, featuring his idol in a way that was audible and prominent, until RCA and Colonel Parker had Hess's levels brought back down to make room for Elvis himself to be heard clearly. That detail, Elvis having to be convinced to let his own voice be louder than Jake Hess's, says everything about what the music meant to him. The sessions began on the night of May 25, 1966, and ran for 3 nights. Elvis had prepared. The months of private rehearsal at Graceland, working through the material with Hodge and West, showed in how quickly and confidently he moved through the songs. The RCA Studio B account of the sessions is specific and documented. The first song recorded, Run On, took 7 takes to complete, and then Elvis moved to the title track. How Great Thou Art is a Swedish hymn, originally written as a poem by Carl Boberg in 1885 after he experienced a violent thunderstorm while walking home across a Swedish landscape. The poem described the terror and beauty of the natural world, the smallness of human beings against the scale of creation, and the overwhelming emotion of standing in front of something too large to comprehend.
It was translated into English by Stuart K. Hine in 1949, and the English version became widely known in America after George Beverly Shea performed it at a Billy Graham crusade in 1957. From that point, it spread into hymnals and recording repertoires, and eventually it reached Elvis, through a version that his friends Charlie Hodge and Red West had played for him, performed by the Sons of the Pioneers, a Western harmony group whose treatment of the hymn caught Elvis's attention and made him want to record it himself.
The recording took 4 takes. The people watching in the studio noted that Elvis poured every ounce of energy he could muster into the final performance, and that the song's crescendo ending left him physically drained. That phrase, poured every ounce of energy he could muster, is not music industry language. It is the description of someone who is not performing a song, but inhabiting it completely, using their body as an instrument until there is nothing left. Felton Jarvis stood in the control booth and wept. He was not the only one. The session musicians, the backup singers, the people who had watched Elvis record hundreds of songs across a career that had already stretched more than a decade, they stood in that studio and understood they were hearing something different. Not a performance, not a product. Elvis Presley, at 31 years old, in a recording studio in Nashville, in the middle of the night, singing the music he had been absorbing since he was 2 years old, and his mother carried him to the Assembly of God Church in East Tupelo. Singing it with his idol Jake Hess in the room, with everything the Hollywood years had cost him still present in his body, with the grief of his mother's death 8 years earlier still present, with whatever was happening in his marriage and his career and his private life not gone from him, but channeled into the 4 minutes and 32 seconds of that final take. The album was released on February 27, 1967. It peaked at number 18 on the Billboard 200 and reached number 7 on the Top Country Albums chart. Colonel Parker arranged for a 30-minute radio program using songs from the album to be broadcast on 276 stations across the United States on Palm Sunday, 1967. The album was certified gold, then platinum, then triple platinum, eventually selling over 3 million copies. And on February 29, 1968, at the 10th Annual Grammy Awards, How Great Thou Art won the Grammy Award for Best Sacred Performance. It was Elvis's first Grammy. He had been nominated for Grammys since the late 1950s. He had been one of the best-selling recording artists in American music history for more than a decade. He had made 31 films, he had sold hundreds of millions of records, and his first Grammy was for a gospel album recorded in 3 nights in Nashville, in a studio with Jake Hess standing in the room. Elvis never attended the Grammy ceremony. He was invited every year and never went. His 3 Grammy wins, all 3 for gospel recordings, exist in a glass case at Graceland, where visitors walk past them on the tour, and most of them are surprised to discover that the man who recorded Hound Dog and Jailhouse Rock won his Grammys for sacred music. They should not be surprised. The man who recorded Hound Dog and Jailhouse Rock had learned to perform by watching Jake Hess at the Ellis Auditorium, had built his stage act on what he saw in those Pentecostal services, and had told anyone who asked that gospel music was what he would have chosen if he had been given a choice.
The Grammy was followed by a second nomination in 1968 for the album, and a third Grammy win for his live performance of How Great Thou Art in 1975, recorded at a concert in Memphis and released on the album Elvis Recorded Live on Stage in Memphis. That live version, recorded in 1974, 9 years after the studio version, showed what happened to the song when Elvis had been singing it in front of audiences for years. The studio version is contained and focused, 4 takes of a man pouring everything into a microphone in a room. The live version is the same song opened up to an arena full of people who knew what they were hearing and responded to it. Elvis won his third and final Grammy for that live performance. It was his last Grammy nomination as well. The morning after the May 26, 1966 session, after the 4 takes, after Jarvis wept, after the musicians stood in silence, Elvis described what making the album meant to him. He had been singing gospel music since before he could form the words. He had attended the all-night singings at the Ellis Auditorium as a teenager, had dreamed of being part of a gospel quartet in the way that other young men dreamed of being athletes. He had told a reporter in 1956 that if he could do anything, he would have liked to be in a gospel group. He was 21 when he said it. He was already the most famous young musician in America, and he said the thing he would have liked to be was in a gospel group. He got as close as he could. He made the gospel albums when he could force them through the management machinery that usually had other plans for his output. He sang gospel privately at Graceland for years, without microphones or cameras, because the music was the music and the setting did not matter. He put Jake Hess in the room when he recorded the most important musical statement of his career. Jake Hess sang Known Only to Him at Elvis's funeral in August of 1977. The man Elvis had watched from the church pews of Tupelo stood at the front of Graceland and sang a hymn at the ceremony that marked the end of Elvis's life. That specific detail, that Hess was the singer chosen for that service, is the last chapter of a story that had started in an Assembly of God church 39 years earlier, with a toddler sliding off his mother's lap and running toward the choir because he could not bear to be still while the music was happening. The recording of How Great Thou Art from the 1967 album is on every streaming platform. So is the 1974 live version from Memphis. Listen to both. In the studio version, listen for the moment where the vocal crescendo builds past what seems possible and then goes further, the moment Felton Jarvis heard from the other side of the glass and could not remain composed. In the live version, listen for the audience, the silence as he builds, and then what happens when he hits the peak. Jake Hess said Elvis went about as far as you could go in gospel music, and the women would jump up just like they do for the pop shows. He was not exaggerating. If this kind of story is what brings you here, subscribe and more of them will find you. See you in the next one.